Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we're back with more. The Massacre at El Mozote. Yeah, it's been a while since I've did some reading on this. Like I've said on some of the other videos, I took a week off because I let my mind just go so far off course. But anyway, let's go ahead and jump into this. Sometime during the incident at La Tejera, but that Wednesday afternoon, word came over the radio that the first company of the Atlacatl had engaged the guerrillas. There was an exchange of fire, an armed confrontation, the guide says, but like so much else in this story, the battle, its intensity, even its precise location, has become a matter of fierce dispute. From the start, the Salvadoran army claimed that the fighting took place in El Mozote itself. On December 17th, 8 days later, a CIA officer cabled from San Salvador that the heaviest fighting had occurred at El Mozote, where 30 to 35 insurgents and 4 Salvadoran soldiers were killed. It is impossible to know for sure, but from the context of the cable, it seems very probable that the CIA man's information came one way or another from the Salvadoran army. The guide from Perquin, on the other hand, who was a few miles away and heard the report on the fighting as it came over the Atlacatl radio, places it around Arambala. It was a little skirmish, he told me, and it happened at El Portillon near Arambala, a little over a mile from El Mozote. Villalobos, who appears to remember the operation in great detail, also insists that the fighting took place at Arambala, which was in effect our rear guard, he said. Although most of the serious fighting took place south of us, along the Torola, there was a minor level of fighting, including maybe a little mortar fire near Arambala. He went on to say it's normal when you place a large force to leave small units to protect, when you displace a large force to leave small units to protect the retreat and keep up resistance. Guerrilla squads around Arambala north of La Guacamaya would have been in a perfect position to protect the flank of the main guerrilla force as it retreated west. Santiago, who was still in La Guacamaya, readying his radio Vinqueremos crew for the night's retreat, describes how the pressure of the enemy was growing in his north-south advance. On that day, he writes in his memoirs, the comrades of the 4th section took by assault a position of the Atlacatl battalion and captured 2 rifles, a plausible number in view of the 4 dead that the Salvadoran army apparently acknowledged. But Santiago makes no mention of the 30 to 35 insurgents killed that were claimed by the CIA cable, and neither, as far as I know, does any other guerrilla memoir. This would have been a very large number of dead. The fact that no one mentions them, and the fact that in the wake of this fighting, the guerrillas did not manage, as Santiago recounts, to maintain the lines of fire and organized the movement to break the circle and make a joke of Monterosa's hammer blow. These two facts lead one to wonder whether the officers, in providing their reports to their superiors and possibly to the CIA, had created a victory at El Mozote from what was in fact a defeat at Arambala. The officers would have been especially reluctant to admit a defeat at the hands of the 4th Section, an elite guerrilla unit. It had been trained in large part by Captain Francisco Emilio Mena Sandoval, one of the army officers who had deserted the guerrillas the previous January. Salvadoran officers had developed a deep hatred for Mena Sandoval, regarding him and others like him as much more despicable forms of life than, say, Villalobos. In their eyes, the latter was merely a delinquent terrorist, whereas officers like Mena Sandoval were traitors. And as it happened, the officers and men of the Atlacado had a special reason not only to hate Mena Sandoval, but to remember with the greatest distaste the town of Arambala and also the hamlet of El Mozote just down the road. It was near Arambala 8 months earlier that the first unit of the brash new Atlacado had ventured forth to show the guerrillas and the rest of the army what it was made of, and it was there that, to the embarrassment of its officers and men, the highly touted new unit suffered a humiliating defeat, in large part because Captain Mena Sandoval had had the foresight to steal an army radio when he came over to the guerrillas. Thanks to the radio and Mena Sandoval's knowledge of the enemy's codes, the rebels were able to keep one crucial step ahead of their opponents. We monitored the movements of their advance, writes Mena Sandoval in his memoirs. They fell into the ambush we had set and responded only with a disorderly retreat. On the radio we could hear their frightened shouts. We caused them a considerable number of casualties and recovered the first 2 M16s to be taken from the Atlacado Brigade. Later in the same operation, Mena Sandoval writes, the enemy directed various companies toward grouping areas in Arambala, orienting its advance so that for its first objective it would reach the hamlet of El Mozote. But the rebels were able to fight this war of position one crucial step ahead of their opponents. We defended one line on the outskirts of El Mozote, which the enemy was unable to take for many days. Their cost in casualties kept growing, as did our morale. It has been 12 days of combat, and we had almost no casualties. Finally, after 22 days of intense fighting, the army says Mena Sandoval had intended a quick strike operation of perhaps 72 hours. The guerrillas slipped away across the Black Road under cover of night, taking 2,000 civilians along with them. By proving their staying power while suffering very few casualties, they had won a significant political victory. As for the Atlacado, news of its poor performance spread quickly through the army. Soon, officers and soldiers began passing on a little joke. The Atlacado's designation as a Biri, they said, stood not for immediate reaction infantry battalion, as everyone had thought, but for immediate retreat infantry battalion. This kind of needling would likely have ensured that 8 months later, many officers and soldiers in the Atlacado would have retained vivid memories of Arambala and El Mozote. Now, after the initial engagement on Wednesday, according to the guide, we heard on the radio that the other company killed people there. Under the gaze of Major Caceres, who was then with the first company, the troops entered the town of Arambala, brought out the people who had remained there, and assembled them in the plaza. They led the women and children to the church and locked them inside. The troops ordered the men to lie face down on the ground, whereupon they bound them, blindfolded them, and began to beat them, demanding information about the guerrillas. A number of men, the guide believes as many as 20, and his estimate agrees with the figure given by the detailed analysis of the operation in and around El Mozote by Tutela Legal, the San Salvador Archbishopric's Human Rights Office in November 1991, though other estimates range as low as 3, were taken from the assembly, led away, and executed. In Arambala, the officers still relied on their list to select who would die. However, by the following afternoon, Thursday, the lists had run out, and at some point, perhaps that day, perhaps late the day before, the officers made a decision about the direction the operation was to take. For example, Rufina Amaya's bitter conviction that there had been a betrayal, that the officer who had spoken to Marcos Diaz as he left Gotera was taking part in a nefarious plot to make sure that the people of El Mozote stayed in their homes to await the fate that had been planned for them. An equally likely explanation, and in a way the more horrible one, is that the officer was in fact trying to do his friend Diaz and the people of the hamlet a favor, for at that point nothing whatever may have been planned for them. Whenever the officers made the decision, it is clear by the time they reached El Mozote, they had ordered a change in tactics. They had list from Perquin, south of Arambala, the guide told me. But further down, there were no lists. Farther down, they killed everything down to the ground. Farther down was scorched earth. Just after midnight on Wednesday, as the men of the Atlacado settled down to sleep, as long columns wound its way out of La Guacamaya and snaked slowly through the ravines and gullies, heading west toward the Black Road, the guerrillas and their entourage traveled quietly. The only sound in the tense darkness was that of hundreds of moving feet. The fighters came first, lugging their rifles and ammunition and whatever other supplies they could manage. Then came the civilian followers, loaded down with the bundles of clothing and sacks of tortillas and coffee, and nervously hushing their children. And at the rear came the men and women of Radio Vinqueramos, bent under the weight of the transmitter and the generator and the other equipment that formed the station's heart. In the end, it was these burdens which betrayed them. The weight slowed them, so that as they finally came within sight of the Black Road, struggling along in increasing panic, the darkness thinned and faded. Dawn broke behind them, and they could see, as they gazed toward from the hiding place, a ravine full of prickly maguey. The men of the Atlacado rising and stretching there on the highway. One soldier was swirling his poncho around him to free it of moisture, and the first rays of sunlight glinted off the droplets. The guerrillas had been caught, but turning back was out of the question. There was nothing for it but to run. "Advance!" Jonas ordered. Or, I guess it would be Jonas ordered. No one moved. "Advance, I say!" A handful of guerrillas broke from their cover, zigzagging in a wild, desperate sprint toward the road, staggering under the weight of their equipment. A moment passed before they heard the shouts of the soldiers, and a moment more before the bullets started to come. They took cover and returned fire, then again ran, took cover, and fired. But they were badly exposed, and by the time they had managed to cross 150 yards of open country, 3 men had been hit. One of them, Tony, had been carrying the transmitter, and as he collapsed, his precious burden slipped from his back and tumbled down, end over end, into another ravine. His comrades gathered around him. Tony was dying. The bullets kept coming. There was no question of retrieving the transmitter. Monterosa would have his war prize. When the troops reassembled, Jonas offered the Vinceramos crew to head south, so the guerrilla to the guerrilla base at Ucuraran. During the nightmarish week of forced night marches that followed, the now voiceless Santiago would turn to his shortwave to hear the triumphant voice of his adversary coming to him from Monterosa's own propaganda station, Radio Truth. "Desert, Santiago," it said. "Where are you? What are you doing out there? We have you surrounded, Jonas. We are going to finish you off. You've already lost." But that came later. The next evening, after they had spent a day and a night fleeing through the ravines, the Radio Vinceramos crewmen were struggling up the slope of the great volcano that broods over northern Morazan when they paused to catch their breath. As they bent over, gazing back toward the mountains they had just fled, they could see, rising from the red zone over El Mozote, great columns of black smoke. But we'll go ahead and end this episode here. Yeah, we're already seeing the reports speaking differently of what happened. We see reports that, oh, there was this huge number of insurgents, while others were like, no, there wasn't. It was civilians. You know, and in an attempt, as the book said, it may have been an attempt to keep them safe and just say, stay where you are. Don't give the army a reason to think you're out there against them, doing things against them. But unfortunately, it ended up causing this huge loss of life, this massacre at El Mozote. Yeah. But, anyway, as always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone try to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, later.